Kia ora koutou, ka mihi kia koutou tēnei wā. Ko ruahine te paemonga, ko taki tumu te waka, all sounding good so far. Bit of a left turn, rangi tike te awa, ko Ngāti Hauiti te iwi. So I hail from the other side of the ranges. I'd just like to, looking out at the sea today, I'd like to acknowledge some of our common tupuna. And I'm thinking about why on earth did Tamatia Polkai Whenua leave here to do his hikoi around the North Island when it's such a beautiful place here. But I'm very thankful that he did. I also want to recognise Renata Kawepo. We have a pātere in Ngāti Hauiti, and it actually explains how we relate to all the other iwi and the taio around the region. And it starts off in Rata, and it goes north towards Wairua. It goes over the Tamannaah Wai ranges. It comes down through Ahuriri and Hawke's Bay, goes down through the Taniwha Plains, and then circles back around to the Manawatu Gorge. It takes quite a long time to go through that pātere, because it's quite a long trip, but to bring it back to the story about Kawepo, what it does is it uses Kawepo's missionary duties into the rangitike to spread the gospel. And it uses his trip as a way, as almost like a motif that joins that whole korero together. And the final person I'd like to acknowledge today is one of my karaua who used to live not far from here at Otorata, back in the day when it was a massive, massive parsite. So it's lovely to be with my cousins here today. Now, when Naio first asked me to come here, I was doing some work. It was sponsored by the Law Foundation on a Tino Rangatira Tanga approach to freshwater management, and that was about 6 months ago. Now, since that time, I've actually written that all down. If you're on Facebook, if you go and look up Peter Fraser, Guerrilla Economist, I've written it all up on Facebook. But what's happened is that since that time that we originally spoke, and this time, we've had a subsequent conversation, and we thought it would be a good thing that we actually move the korero along, and in the context of Three Waters, in the context of substantial RMA reform, I've been involved with that with the Taikaha, which is the group. It comprises of the New Zealand Māori Council, Whauma and Kahui Wai Māori. I've been very closely involved in that process over the last 3 or 4 months. So it's a slightly different korero than what I was going to do, but we've still kept the same name. So we'll see how it goes. Now, how do I get this coming up? Here we go. I've got 20 minutes. Now, do I get a ding at 5? A ding at 5 to go, and then 2 dings off?
There's one ding at 1 and you're off.
Okay, beautiful, thank you. Okay, I want to go through, there's 4 things I want to quickly talk about today, because I've got 4 minutes each. First I want to talk about Tamannaah Wai, about why that is really important. And I know pretty much all of you know that's really important, but I want to bring a particular aspect to that. I want to talk about Coast 101. Now, those of you that aren't economists, this is where all of our fisheries, our radio spectrum, our carbon trading, this is the korero it all came from. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about freshwater royalties, because it is something that is missing in the conversation. And finally, I want to talk about transition issues, because I spend a lot of time in and around the dairy industry, and I found that transition is their favourite way of not doing anything. Because we want to keep the status quo, because we'll do a transition, and the transition is about 300 years. So I want to speed up that transition issue. Okay, Tamannaah Wai. Okay, For those whānau in the room who don't know about Tamannaah Wai, I want to give a very, very quick introduction. What it is, it's a way to allocate water. It's a hierarchical framework, and puts water into 3 levels. First is the water for the water body itself. Secondly is the water that's needed for human sustenance. And thirdly is the water for everything else, like John Bostock. So, we call him Tier 3 water. Now, the critical thing about Tamannaah Wai is that it is not a Māori framework, it's informed by Māori thinking. And I think that's a better way of putting it. And what it does is it puts the health and the Māori of the water body first. Because the idea is that if you put the Māori of the water body first, then the second need, which is human need for sustenance, that will always be looked after. So when we try to explain this to David Parker, who's very, very keen on intergenerational equity, by the way, and if he's not told you he's very keen on intergenerational equity, I'll tell you now because he'll tell you again. But we don't need to think about intergenerational equity, not because we don't think it's important, we do. But if you don't wreck the damn water body in the first place, you don't have to worry about your mokos, because it will still be there. It's kind of that simple. Now what we've got is in the freshwater NPS National Policy Statement from 2020, it's actually incorporated Tamannaah Wai as part of it. Now that gives some really big opportunities and it gives some really big risks. I want to start off with the risks first. One of the risks that I've already alluded to is of basically, I'll put it this way, One thing I've learned 20 years working around government and 10 years in Treasury, and then a lot of time around the dairy industry, there's a very simple rule of politics in New Zealand. It's 5 million cows are more important than 5 million people. Once you understand that, everything else makes sense. The second thing you've got to remember is that the dairy industry and agriculture more generally is New Zealand's answer to the NRA. Now, I'm not saying they go around and shoot people, I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that they are the lobby group with an asymmetric amount of power given what they actually do. And what the dairy industry does is 3.5% of GDP, which tells me that 96.5% of GDP has nothing to do with anything that goes moo. Now, where we have the implementation risks is that they will slow it down. Because if you start to put the water body first, it starts costing people money. And then they will spin it out. So this is why, well done whānau for getting awards, well done. You need to be there, you need to be at the table. This is not about representation, it's not about consultation, it's about Māori decision making. You need to be there and you need to implement Tamannaah Wai. And here's a bit of a hint, now is good. Now, once you get to Tier 3 water, otherwise known as John Bostock water, you have commodified it. Now, we can have lots of korero about different types of why, but once you get to Tier 3, it is commodified. So that gets me on to this matua here called Ronald Coase. Now, Coase is an economist. He's dead now, most of them are. He only wrote 2 papers in his career, so he wasn't exactly prolific. But they're so mind-blowingly brilliant, he got the Nobel Prize for them. So if he'd written 3, God knows, it probably made him king or something like that, probably Pope. But what Coase says in a nutshell, I come from Wellington, and we used to have a guy in Wellington called L.V. Martin that used to sell refrigerators and washing machines and things like that. Now, back in the day, they were all rubbish, and they all broke down, and they're all crap. And so, what he would say, look, I know the fridge I'm selling you is crap, but guess what? I've got a really good service department. And if it is not put it right, then call me, I'll put it right. It's the putting right that counts. So in a nutshell, so cut away all of the mathematics, all of the intimidating diagrams, all of the numbers that no one can understand, they used to intimidate people at cocktail parties and things like that. Cut through that. What the Coase theorem says is it doesn't matter what the initial allocation is of whatever it is, whether it be water, whether it be fish, whether it be radio spectrum, whether it be whatever. Because as long as you've got a secondary market, now for those of you that don't know what a secondary market is, trade me is a good example of a secondary market. As long as you've got something like trade me, if it's not in the right place at the beginning, it'll be get right at the end. Now, economists, so what they say is the initial allocation doesn't matter. Now what I'm telling you as Māori is, yes it does. Yes it does. And the reason is that what Matua Ronald has talked about is an efficiency argument. And economists like me, we love efficiency. We get PhDs and talk about it all the time and bore everyone on it. We really like efficiency. But the point is for Māori, particularly under the Resource Management Act, and particularly with a first in, first served water allocation system, which means that in many cases we've missed out completely, and we now have an over-allocated catchment, and it doesn't matter what the allocation system is, because there's nothing left. So what I'm saying here is that when it comes to economics, do not buy the argument the initial allocation doesn't matter, because go back to Wai 2358, which is the recent Waitangi. The Stage 2 report goes to something like 614 pages. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. But what it says is that there's an equity story for Māori that needs to be treated quite distinctly. So when it comes to water allocation, we've got Tamannaah Wai, but the second thing I'm telling you about is don't get seduced by your Ronald Coase stuff that says the initial allocation doesn't matter. Yes, it does. Yes, we want it. We want it now. We want it for Māori, and we want water. We don't want shares in water companies. We don't want other things. We want water. I think I've said that. Do we have an equity problem? How am I going for time? Good. We're rocking along. Water royalties. Now, water royalties is a really tough subject because as an economist, I don't have a problem with the idea of a royalty. For example, if we were doing, or I don't know, deep sea mining, or if someone had the silly idea of actually going and doing deep sea oil drilling out there, not that anyone would ever have thought of doing anything that silly, but in all seriousness, if they did strike some of the black stuff, then it would normally be expected that there would be a royalty paid by whichever the company that struck it, that would then come back to the government and mere. So I see absolutely no difference why there should not be some sort of royalty for water. I'll give you a really simple example in comparison. Imagine for some reason you wanted to go and set up a massive power station, hydropower station, and then ship a whole lot of aluminium bauxite from Australia and take it down to the bottom of South Island and turn it into Coke cans. Because that's kind of what we do. Because that's adding value. It's also exporting electricity, but that's really hard to do, but Coke cans make it easy. Now, if you went to Rio Tinto, which is the flash name for Comalco, and said, you can have as much electricity as what you want from Manapuri for free. And all you've got to do is pay for the cost of transporting it there on the high voltage or the HVDC. It's basically a big pylon that just chunks the electricity down there. But if you basically pay the transport costs, that's all you've got to pay for, you can have the electricity for nothing. You'd think, that's a pretty stupid deal.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what we do. That's exactly what we do with water. It's almost like going to, I mentioned Trade Me before, but if you went to Amazon and said, you could get anything you want from Amazon, but just pay the delivery fee. That's what we do with water. So what I'm saying is that one of the reasons, what economics tells us, is if you put a zero price on something, people use too much of it. I remember a briefing we gave to Jim Anderton when he was Minister of Agriculture about 12 years ago. And we took him down and showed him one of these centre pivots in Canterbury. And he goes, well, how much water does that use? And we said, well, quite a lot, Minister. And he said, well, how much is quite a lot? And we said, about the same amount as Christchurch. And he goes, what, in a year? He goes, no, in a day. He goes, so that thing uses the same amount of water as Christchurch in a day? Yep. So this is what happens if you do not put a price on something, then people use lots of it. If you start to put a price on it, then guess what? People start using less of it. So I would see putting a price on it is very important for Māori for two reasons. One, we're not going to pay for it. And secondly, that's a way to get water back in over-allocated catchments. It's as simple as that. Now there's a real political problem of what do you do with the money? Because I'll be really, really blunt. If you've got, you can just see it now that Judith Collins is saying that all of those Maoris getting all this money from these poor farmers like John Bostock. How does that work? That's just not going to fly politically. But the need for a royalty is actually a very important one. It serves a very important purpose. So what my argument would be is treat it the same way that Norway treated its North Sea oil revenues. It saw them as windfall revenues and it put them in a sovereign fund. What I'd do is put the water revenues in a sovereign fund, and the closest thing we have is the New Zealand Superannuation Fund or the Cullen Fund. And that would depoliticise it. And what it would give is that that money would then be made available to everyone, potentially intergenerationally. Okay, heading along towards the end. Transition issues. We heard about the inanga before. Okay. Economists, we like putting things around things because it makes us sound more intelligent, and we're just really like Peter Jackson. We just make stuff up. So I'm going to call it X, Y, and Z because I can't think of more than 3 variables in my head at any one time. So imagine we're in a place such as the Hawke's Bay, not that we are. And let's say that we had an over-allocation of water, not that we do. And let's say we have a whole lot of Māori that have lots of land, but don't have lots of land, but not as much as we used to about 180 years ago. I was angry about that, we're fixing that. But in all seriousness, if you want the water back, so we've got an existing allocation of water, that's going out there now. Why is what I call the Tier 3 water. So I think that at this point, someone's already made a decision about how much stays in the river. Māori need to be part of that decision or be making that decision. So we've already got a decision around Tier 3 water. Now what I'm saying is that Wai must be the new allocation that includes Māori. Now, I've just used Māori broadly because I realise we come under iwi, there's hapu, there's land trust, there's mea, and I'm not going to miss out anybody, so I've called Māori, so we're inclusive and love everybody. So, what we need, and so there's 2 things in this Tier 3 water that we need to sort out. How much do Māori need? How much stays in the river? And the final one is the over-allocation, because that's how much that needs to go away. And that's what needs to change. Thank you.